I think to myself, to be a black man in America, I mean, I could have the most accomplished resume, and I can do all this great work, but yet when I step out in the streets, I'm still just a black man.
Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name!
Tylik, obviously any kind of interview with you has to, I think, start with George Floyd because he had such a profound impact on so many. We saw so many protests. Can you talk to me about how it impacted you personally and where have we come as a country as a result of the protest movements that occurred, do you think?
Yeah, I remember exactly when our organization first got the call about George Floyd. As we know, Reverend Sharpton had did the eulogy and our team was on it. And I think, you know, when George Floyd, we saw the knee on his neck for over 9 minutes, I think it was a clear example of what we all face in this country, people of color in this country all the time, the knee on our neck, as Reverend Sharpton talked about. And we not only see the knee on our neck as it comes into policing, but in several different areas of our lives. But I think when I saw George Floyd in that moment, it made me reflect on, you know, my father and my brothers, and really myself, to know that when we walk outside of our doors, when we are returning home, our parents are expecting us to return and our families are expecting us to return. But this is this reality in this country that some of us don't know if we will return back because of, you know, racism and police violence that we see in our communities. And so I think when we see what happened after George Floyd, we saw a protest that not only erupted across cities across this country, but we saw a protest that erupted around the world. And I think it woke up the world. And I think in that moment, our leaders didn't take heed of the momentum that we had to address policing and to address our criminal justice system holistically. But I think we really missed the ball in that moment and we dropped the ball. And yet here we are, and we still see, you know, cases month after month, day after day, names we know and names we don't know, of folks who are slain in the streets, in their homes. Can't sleep in peace, Breonna Taylor. We can't run in peace, Ahmaud Arbery. We can't breathe, George Floyd, Eric Garner. And so it's a reality that we face that we still have to address.
Tylik is the Washington, D.C. Bureau Policy Advisor and National Director of Youth and College for the National Action Network, one of the leading civil rights organizations in the United States.
You grew up in Southern Virginia, kind of a small town. You're
Yes.
here in Washington, D.C. And I think people who grow up in places like that, and we had a chance to talk beforehand, you talked about the excitement of coming to Washington and actually
Yes.
walking in the Capitol. But I think most people don't see how the sausage made and compromise and
Yes.
all this sort of thing, and they want action. As a young man here, how eye-opening was it to come and see that, and how difficult is it to navigate that?
Very eye-opening. I remember when I was so excited got accepted to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation internship program, and I was an intern on the Hill. My first time, I had my Capitol Hill badge, and I was so excited to roam the halls, and really sitting in those committee meetings and drafting, letters for my particular member. I really saw the back and forth, whether it's the members meeting with members and really just the split between the aisle. I think a lot of times here in DC, we talk about bipartisanship, but to be honest, it's very difficult to come by. But I think I do believe that there is middle ground where we can meet. But I think a lot of times people are so blinded by their own ideology. They're blinded by their own, pockets and the profits of their campaign. That a lot of times people put profit before people, and it should be people before profit. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating when you see folks, arguing about little things that, in my mind, it's like, what is this argument about? Why are we arguing to the fact of a mother being able to feed her children? Why are we arguing about a child being able to have a a fair education, not based on their zip code. I come from a small town, very underfunded schools, a rural community. And so a lot of these things, it's like, why are we arguing about? We look just recently, the United States Supreme Court, striking down Roe v. Wade. Why are men telling women what to do with their bodies? And so I think, a lot of these things we see like why is it happening? But it's just like people are stuck in what they believe, and they're not looking for the middle ground.
Middle ground, when you think of, I spoke to a legislator who was in Congress years ago, who's been retired for some time now, but he said what he used to do is he'd talk to another member from another party and he'd say, we might start with a real small circle where we agree on something and you expand it. You don't even see that that much now. Do you think gerrymandering's the problem, and how do we get around that?
Yeah, so actually, I mentioned I went to school at North Carolina A&T State University, which is one of the nation's largest historically Black colleges and universities. And while I was in school, my very campus was gerrymandered. Our campus was split between 2 congressional districts, and yet we have a predominantly Black community and Black school, and yet every year we had to re-register folks on campus just to be able to vote in the next election. And so when you think about this, as former Attorney General Eric Holder had mentioned, down to surgical precision, the fact that we are aware if folks come to register, one cycle, you keep going back to them over and over and over again and making the registration process long, then folks won't show up. And as Reverend Jesse Jackson mentioned, why not make, just as we put folks in selective service when they first, turn 18, why not give folks, just that access, the right to vote as soon as they turn 18? And so we continue to see ways where voting becomes harder for communities, but in particular, voting becoming harder for communities of color.
Virginia's northern region is a wealthy place, although not all of the neighborhoods share the same benefits. These particular districts are at the center of a 2021 study from Virginia Commonwealth University, which examines the region's 400-year history of racial segregation.
Glenn Youngkin ran for governor there and used some of these culture wars as well. It still seems to be an issue out there about education and what should be taught in schools. I want to get your thoughts on that race and the outcome of it, and your thoughts about using this issue, which is the history of the United States, and people saying that part of this shouldn't be taught in schools.
Right, and I think that when we begin to tell parts of our history, then it creates a view of, like they said, this utopia that we want people to believe and to forget about. But I think it's critically important to understand where we are now to be able to better position ourselves for where we are trying to go. If we cannot recognize that slaves were enslaved and drug, here by force and forced to work free labor, if we cannot recognize, the fact of when we look at what happened to Martin Luther King. I believe that Martin Luther King was not jailed in Alabama, knifed in his chest, shot down in cold blood on the balcony of Memphis for us to bury our heads today. Fannie Lou Hamer didn't say, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." John Lewis didn't get his head beat over crossing the Edmonds Pettus Bridge for us to, to forget about these things. But they are a true mark in our history. And I think the full scope of this country should be taught. I don't believe that we would have achieved the Voting Rights Act. I don't believe we would have achieved the Fair Housing Act or a lot of these landmark pieces of legislation that we saw if it was not for the full scope of our history.
Black Americans are less likely than white or Hispanic Americans to believe that the widespread use of facial recognition technology will make policing fairer. Only 22% of black adults say it will make policing fairer, while 29% say it will make policing less fair, and about half say it will make no difference. This is from a recent Pew Research Center poll.
You said something that really caught my ear. Your father's a police officer, and you're involved in this kind of work. You want to see reforms. Was there any tension there, or how did he feel about this?
You know, I have a lot of family who was in law enforcement, and I just think, you know, he's open to perspective. I think we're not saying that we hate police, but we're just saying that we need to figure out how we transform how we view policing in this country, how we view public safety in this country. I do believe that, you know, police play a part in our community to help keep our community safe, and we thank them for their service. But I don't think police are the end-all, be-all to public safety. I think, you know, we talk about community safety, investment in our schools, investment in mental health services, investment in these wraparound services are really things that help create community safety because we are investing in communities. And so not only, I don't think we should invest in police budgets, but we should also invest in community budgets.
Talk to me about activism. You know, like what was it that drew you to this, and what's this work been like for you?
I feel like it's a calling to a sense. I feel like God has called me to do this work, and I think when we understand that it's bigger than just ourselves. It's bigger than, you know, waking up and putting our clothes on and going to our jobs and, you know, going in this routine of life. But to understand that though we may have woke up with you know, food on our table, clothes on our back, a roof over our head, some folks do not have that same opportunity. And so I think it is our job in places of privilege, because we're all privileged in some way, to figure out how we can be of help to someone who may be less fortunate than what we are. And so it's a work of service, but it's you got to feel it in your heart to really do it wholeheartedly.
Well, part of the conversation is talking about bringing the chair to the table, and you've sat in on meetings with some pretty notable folks. We were chatting about that. You've been very kind of subdued about describing your life here in Washington, D.C., but you've been in meetings with some big name individuals. Are there times when you're like, geez, I'm a kid from a small town in Southern Virginia, and here I am. Describe that. What's that like, first time being in a session like that?
Definitely. I remember my first time going to the White House and meeting with folks on the president's administration, and I'm surrounded in a room representing my organization at the time, and, you know, being the youngest one in the room. And I think it could be so scary, but also I recognize the weight that I carry walking into those hallways. And I echo the words that my grandmother would tell me, boy, you better walk in there with your head held high, your shoulders up, like God sent you there. And I'm reminded like that I'm here for a reason. And I think, and I want young people to know that as well. Like when you go into these spaces of politics, we see it as, you know, not a young person's game. But I want to tell every young person out there that you deserve to be in those spaces just as much, because your lived experience, it happened for a reason. And you don't let anybody make your voice any smaller than what it is. And though my voice may tremble sometimes, I still speak truth to power.
That first time, a little shaky?
Little shaky. But after a while, I'm telling you, you get the hang of it. You just say what you need to say and keep moving.
Are there days when you feel like, geez, you know, I'm just banging my head against the wall? And
sometimes it's like a process. It's like, you know, like, what are we doing here? Like some of these things, like, why are we negotiating these things that we think is so, that should be plain and simple, but it's not that simple. If life was that simple. But yeah, it's definitely frustrating, but you gotta keep it moving.
You believe in hope and change.
I do. I say rest if you must, but don't you quit.
And unfortunately, we do have to quit. That's going to close this out. But thanks so much for talking to us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.